But it's okay, ASRock, because we wouldn't expect you to validate the literal first option on the first page of BIOS. Benchmarking the APUs today has had one massive challenge and frustration, and it's this chart. This is the chart that started a conversation at AMD, leading to the brand new R7-8700G and R5-8600G getting immediate changes in the near future that will improve their performance. This huge drop in frequency is from a power limit that kicks in around the 100-second mark into running this particular workload on this board. In fact, we delayed our entire review to research this behavior when we used our power measurement device interposer to log the power behavior during Cyberpunk gaming testing. In this chart, you can see that for almost 5 minutes of gameplay, the 8700G was holding at about 80 watts through the EPS 12-volt cables. Then, around the 280-second mark, we hit a hard wall that dropped power to about 60 watts. This also happened with the 8600G at around the 110-second mark. This also happened in Baldur's Gate 3 testing, where these 3 runs are near 80 watts, with the 4th run dropping to 60 watts. In some ways, it's familiar to Intel's old Tau behavior. All of this can be quickly summarized with these 3 numbers. These 3 are the same CPU. The only difference is that for the baseline entry at 15.8 minutes render time for Blender, we launched from idle and we had STAPM on, so it was stock behavior. With the no STAPM option, we had disabled it. The reduction was 8.3% alone from that change. And then the pre-STAPM result was terrible. It was 17.4 minutes. So from worst to best, we have a 17% improvement. The reason it's worse with preloading with some other application is because STAPM is an accumulated value. So when we exited a different application and immediately went into Blender and started rendering our animation, this was the result. And this pretty well tells the story of why we had some challenging decisions to make for the reviews process. Which of these do you choose? Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the GN Store discount code STAP, S-T-A-P, for 10% off while the code lasts. You can use the code STAP for supporting us while getting something in return, like the Disappointment PC Build t-shirt listing all of 2023's worst hardware launches in a tour date style on the back. We're running low on stock, but we still have Heather Charcoal with the exploded memory diagram on the front, and we've still got some of the cotton in stock. It's fitting for the APUs to get that memory explosion diagram. You can also grab one of our high quality and ultra heat resistant thick silicone soldering mats with tool holders, our large GN15 mod mats with pinout diagrams, and more on store.gamersnexus.net. This is a carryover from devices like the Ally that you see now. It's from skin temperature aware power management, from the mobile and handheld parts from which these APUs are derived. But skin temperature aware power management, or STAPM as AMD pronounces it, is intended to reduce the shell temperature of a handheld device or a laptop. And it shows where AMD's focus has been shifted lately. It's been in those devices. There's no reason to induct this feature to the desktop variant of the same silicon though, and since it can be controlled at a firmware level, it's not intrinsic to the silicon despite sharing a solution. We brought this up to AMD right at embargo lift because we needed a sanity check from someone particularly qualified at AMD to speak on the matter. We've actually shown him on the channel a few times.
This is the first AM5 part that I killed.
And that started a process where AMD moved impressively fast and got the engineers together and came back to us with an answer by end of review embargo day. And here it is. Quote, "We found out that STAPM is being incorrectly applied to the desktop parts. It shouldn't be applied to the desktop parts. A future BIOS update should correct this behavior. If nothing else, you caught something that is going to help a lot of customers. So better to catch it sooner than later. Thanks for finding this." So AMD plans to ship a BIOS update in the next AGESA patch. It'll take a little bit for that to come out. And that will change the skin temperature aware behavior of the desktop APUs, because the obvious argument against it is why? It's in a motherboard in a case. You're probably not holding the case, and you probably don't have your tower in your lap. So it doesn't quite deserve the same types of protections as a laptop or a handheld might. Now for end users, the difference between STAPM being toggled on and off It might not be noticeable. It really depends on the scenario, because since it's an APU, it's got CPU and GPU components, they get loaded differently. So in different scenarios, we've seen a mix of impact from close to zero to actually noticeable, like what we showed earlier. But from a testing standpoint, it triggered a lot of tests and retests because we were trying to understand why the performance was slowly dropping as we spent longer in the game running those back-to-back test passes. And specifically, we encountered this in games where we don't load a save game file to do the next pass. So ones where we basically stay in the game and just walk back to the start of the test pass. That's where it popped up for us the most. Oh, and also, ASRock's PBO menu item, the literal first thing in the BIOS, doesn't work. We found that and many other BIOS bugs while working on this review. For the most part, STAPM doesn't affect the results, which is good for the review, but there are a few key areas where it does, and we'll talk about, again, how we're kind of averaging over that. Sometimes, even when the power drops, though, it's simply not enough to move the frame rate meaningfully one way or the other. But in either case, it'll be a little bit different, and whenever the next BIOS update ships, for users who have the 8600 and 8700G APUs that we're reviewing today. It really just depends on the game and how heavily it loads things. But first, let's cut over to yesterday, Steve, and learn about the basics of the APUs, how much they cost, and what they're supposed to do. Today's review is a little different and simple by our standards. We're reviewing the AMD 8600G and 8700G APUs. These have disproportionately powerful integrated graphics components in them. They're using the 760M for the 8600G and 780M for the 8700G. And the pricing makes for an interesting comparison at the ultra budget end. It's $230 for the 8600G and then $330 for the 87. For APUs, again, one of the most important aspects is simply the system memory. That's because for a video card, you have the GPU core, that's located centrally on this one. It is surrounded in this case by memory that is dedicated to the video card, to the GPU, and that's going to operate at a bandwidth, a latency, and actually a physical distance that is advantageous as compared to something like this single solution going out to system memory. And physical distance is one aspect of that, but there's a lot more, again, like just the bandwidth and the latency being key elements. So because the IGPs today don't have any VRAM of any meaningful capacity or any at all on the package, they just have the normal cache, there's really no way to make up for that other than try and go for faster system memory, and it will disproportionately bump the performance as opposed to if you were just using a normal Ryzen desktop CPU. Still benefits, yes, but not nearly as much as in an IGP constrained scenario where you need that speed. Another factor to consider is that APUs, it is not architecturally identical to the 7000 series CPUs that they have right now. So PCIe generation, as an example, goes down a step. But to get you the basics, here's a quick run through of the specs for the parts in review today. The 8700G is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU, has 8 megabytes of L2 and 16 of L3. For the GPU, it's using a Radeon 780M with 12 CUs and clocked at 2900 megahertz. The R5-8600G is a 6-core, 12-thread part with 6 megabytes of L2 and 16 of L3. The CU count on the 760M for the 8600G is just 8, but that's still a significant improvement from the 7700X's CUs at a significantly slower 2200 megahertz. And actually, the AMD Z1 Extreme processor found in something like the ROG Ally is an 8-core, 16-thread part with 12 CUs as well. It's very familiar. The biggest difference between this and the desktop variant, other than socketability, is the extreme power constraints on the Ally. And we're back to modern day, Steve. For my next trick, I'll show ASRock's broken-ass BIOS bug. It's a pretty good trick. So when testing the ASRock board, we noticed some peculiar interplay between STAPM and PBO. PBO, Precision Boost Overdrive, enabling it in ASRock's main BIOS page, the literal first page, unfortunately didn't work properly, and it gives the appearance of applying, but this chart shows it doesn't. The STAPM limit climbs and hits 65 watts after a brief period of 88 watts package power. It should be at least sustained 88 watts, but likely higher with unbound PBO. But to prove that this isn't supposed to happen, we next went to the AMD OC menu in BIOS and we did the literal same thing. We enabled PBO. But this time, we didn't use the ASRock redundant main page menu item that's right front and center in front of everyone. And it worked. In this chart, you can see that STAPM continued to climb and that package power remained elevated. There were multiple other bugs that we found in this launch, but that's the one that's really the most important to talk about because it's the one that's most likely to affect you. A lot of people use PPO. It's a quick way to get a boost to performance if you're not worried about thermal or power. It's okay though, because fortunately, it's unlikely anyone would ever encounter this option. But it's okay, ASRock, because we wouldn't expect you to validate the literal first option on the first page of BIOS. No, that would, I'll say this. I'm glad ASRock has reminded us why we don't use their motherboards for reviews if we can avoid it. It's always pre-launch problems with them. But if you want to use PPO, do it through Ryzen Master or through the AMD OC menu. They both worked fine for us. Okay, so here's some more real-world data showing how these CPUs behave. We'll look at all-core frequency. This also helps us better understand the performance in gaming scenarios between single and all-core workloads. This chart shows the 8700G first, initially running a high frequency of 4600 to 4900 megahertz on average for all cores. That expired relatively quickly and gave way to the sustained clocks of about 4200 megahertz. It's not shown on this graph, but STAPM was at the 65 watt limiter here, so this should change with the BIOS update whenever that ships. Plotting the 8600G now, we observed a similar boost to base dropping behavior, which aligns with the earlier power behavior, moving from 4900 megahertz to 4550 megahertz during the course of testing. It's less severe. It's normal for clocks to be lower in all-core workloads, but for perspective, here's the 7700X. It held 5200 megahertz during the same test when we first reviewed it. What this means is that STAPM will have a greater impact in our testing scenarios where the CPU cores are most heavily loaded and the power consumption of the CPU package power itself is at the highest point. But there's one other thing, which is again that this is a cumulative thing. That means depending on the order of the testing and what came before the current test and how long it ran and how intensive it was, for example, if we run Blender before a game, that'll change the accumulated STAPM value and potentially the resulting frequency. Now some quick validation of the single core boosting to ensure it aligns with the advertising. Here, our 8700G was typically around 5100 to 5150 megahertz, which is equal to or slightly above the advertised claims, and that's a good thing. The 8600G held 50 megahertz solid, also about 50 megahertz over advertised, so AMD has done well to stick with its promise from about a generation or so ago now when it said that it would try to underpromise and over-deliver for frequency. For reference, the 7700X had a single-core max of 5500 to 5550 megahertz. That'll be the biggest contributor to its advantage in many CPU-bound tests, especially when that limit kicks in. In Blender, and after waiting for the CPU to hit steady-state power consumption, we found the 8600G and 8700G to both pull about 61 to 62 watts at the EPS 12-volt rails. This has the two CPUs about equal with an R5-5600 for power consumption, which itself pulled 65 watts, and the i3-13100F is also close by at 66 and functionally equal. Compared to the prior G-series parts, the 5600G was at 72 watts, so AMD has definitely improved for efficiency, and the 5700G was at 95 watts in this test. One thing we did notice was higher initial power consumption than long-term or steady-state draw. This simple chart shows the initial spiked power consumption versus the long-term and steady-state power consumption. The initial draw had these CPUs closer to 80 to 86 watts, but it dropped down rapidly as they began hitting their power targets. Now, because the impact of power consumption here is related to our earlier STAPM discussion, we'll stop discussing it. I thought that was a good one. Looking now at power efficiency and using a Blender all-core workload, we see the 8700G up toward the top of the chart. At 16.1 watt hours to complete the fixed unit of work, it's behind only the 7980X and is just ahead of the 14700K when locked to 91 watts. The 8600G took longer to complete the render, so despite similar power consumption, its efficiency is predictably lower. Time to get into more testing, so now we're going to look at the CPU-only results without the IGP being utilized. That'll help us establish the ceiling for maximum performance out of the CPU with the current BIOS configuration if you were to upgrade to a dGPU later and stop using that IGP. So that's the purpose of these tests. But as we get into it, some methodological notes. This launch is a mess. The fact that we've been testing an APU in what is currently its default configuration but will soon change, but we don't know when, is challenging. That means we have some considerations for the testing process, and we have to make some decisions on how we want to do the testing. But in addition to all of this, there's one other aspect to consider, and that's that AMD both claimed and didn't claim at various times that 2400 megahertz should be the effective default configuration for Infinity Fabric for the reviews process. But like Schrodinger's fabric, ultimately it was unclear what it was supposed to be, and the company ended up emailing this. They said, quote, "I wanted to follow up and clarify on the note about F-clock from yesterday. We do believe most parts will be stable and provide the best performance at 2400 F-clock. That being said, the default behavior will remain at 2000 F-clock without manual intervention. Thus, results with 2400 would require specific and direct user intervention. To accurately represent the default behavior when Expo is loaded, please keep F-clock at 2000. Then they apologized for it and said, "We value accurately conveying performance and behaviors to your readers as much as you do. If you have any questions, let us know." And this all relates back. So the higher F-clock is an SoC option, but just like the STAPM behavior, we have a strong policy here of representing the product as close to out of the box what you actually get as possible. We do enable Expo and XMP, but that means we don't review a company's hopes and dreams. It's the same as with RTX. When RTX launched for the 20 series and there were literally 0 games available, we didn't review it based on NVIDIA's promise of RTX. We reviewed the product they shipped. Same thing here. So we're not reviewing what AMD hopes people will run it at or what their STAPM behavior might be. Those are admirable and good objectives. We'll look at them when they ship. So methodologically, we're leaving STAPM alone. And that means there are going to be some scenarios where in the run-to-run variance is higher than we would typically like, but that is an actual behavior of the product. And so we view it as a valid behavior to test and represent. So because of that, this means that it sometimes exits some of the testing standards, and what we're doing is just averaging the passes, so you get a couple before STAPM, a couple during the limit applied. When it applies doesn't always affect the results, so it really has to be something where the CPU package power is boosted high, which means a higher CPU workload, and that's not all scenarios, so it won't be there for everything. But let's get into the original edited benchmarks and review. Talk about how these CPUs behave. Now we're going to look at CPU-only performance. This is in production workloads where we're assuming that you're basically only doing work on the CPU, and we've coupled a 4090 with it. The purpose of this is to see what is the maximum performance of the CPU component only. So if you were to buy the APU and then add a GPU later, we get to see what your limitations are and where you would compare versus having gone with a dGPU and a normal CPU. In Blender cycles rendering with 1 tile per thread, the R7-8700G completed the GN logo render in 15.8 minutes, which has it similar to the R5-7600X CPU with the same parts. So the 8-core APU is about the same as the 6-core CPU. The 7700X 8-core 16-thread CPU reduces the total render time by 20% against the 8700G. AMD's APU with 8 cores isn't as powerful as its CPU with 8 cores, but that's not a revelation. The 8600G 6-core part and its 20-minute result has it closest to an R7-3700X 8-core CPU from a few generations back. The most similar 6-core desktop parts by performance would be the 5600X, which allows the 8600G a reduction in render time of 16%, or the 7600X, which reduces the render time from the 8600G by 15% itself. It's basically in the middle of these two. Comparing the two new APUs to each other, the CPU performance of the 8700G gives it a 20% render time reduction as compared to the 8600G. Still CPU-only, compression performance with 7-zip and measured in millions of instructions per second is next. This one has the 8700G at 105,000 MIPS, or behind the 7800X3D and ahead of the R5-7600X. The improvement over the 7600X is about 10%, with improvement over the 8-core 5800X about 12%. The 8700G is behind the modern 8-core 7700X, which leads it by 16%. As for the 8600G, the new APU's 84,000 MIPS result has it behind the 12600K from Intel and ahead of the 3700X from AMD. Compared to 6-core AMD parts, the 7600X leads by 14%, and the 8600G leads the R5-5600X by 13%. In decompression and CPU only, the 8700G's result was 125,000 MIPS, with the 8600G at 97,000 MIPS. In this one, that gives the 8700G a lead of about 30%, which means its performance is disproportionately high in decompression compared to compression. The 8700G sits between a 7800X3D and a 5800X for performance, with the 7700X leading by 15% over the 8700G. The 8600G is between the 3700X and the 5600X, leading the 5600X by about 8%. Now we get into the game testing. So as we were saying earlier, the unique nature of the product and the timing means that this is a simpler review for us. And so we're really only looking at a couple parts on each chart as opposed to the usual like 28 or whatever it was for the GPUs. So the key focus is going to be memory. That means when you're reading the charts, make sure to read it carefully and identify which memory kit is used with each line item. We consider the DDR5-6400 kit to be our baseline for this testing. Then we also have 6000 and 5600 at the low end just to set the floor for you. As a note getting into this too, any of the older data or data that is with desktop CPUs, unless otherwise specified as an IGP, is using our standard hardware. That includes a 4090. Starting with 1080p medium, the 8700G's peak performance with the 4090 is 87 FPS average with DDR5-6400 RAM, or 83.4 with DDR5-6000. The memory is a limiting factor even at this performance level for the CPUs, but not because of the IGP. It's just Ryzen behavior here. Frequency becomes the next limiter for the CPU. The 8600G with a 4090 shows that the CPU is gating performance of the 4090 with a 6% lead from the 8700G over the 8600G when looking at DDR5-6000 only results. Used as you'd expect, though, the 8700G with DDR5-6400 and the IGP runs at 29 FPS average, 14% better than the 8600G at 25 FPS with DDR5-6400, and functionally infinitely better than the 7700X with its IGP, which was completely unplayable. Turning our attention now to memory, the 8700G with DDR5-6400 ran 7.5% ahead of the DDR5-6000 result and an impressive 12% ahead of the DDR5-5600 kit at 25.6 FPS average. Remember, timings come into play here too. Memory definitely matters with an IGP, this isn't news, and using PBO and IGP OC of 200 MHz on the actual GPU component via BIOS gets the 8700G to improve to 31 FPS average. That's an uplift of 10% from baseline, so not bad. You can definitely get more out of this with memory tuning as well. As for the discrete options, the i3-12100F and 6500 XT ran significantly ahead of the APU at 55 FPS average, which is a lead of 120% over the cost equivalent 8600G. The 1200F and RX 6600 are CPU bound, otherwise the 6600 would provide much more uplift here, but this is cool data because we can see where the ceiling of usefulness is for a CPU in a given budget. An i5 or equivalent modern R5 would do much better here. We have some data from October will show that shows a higher FPS ceiling, and it'd be somewhere around 5 to 10% higher still if retested with the newest patch, but this is only here to demonstrate that the 1200F is limiting the 6600. Only for purposes of showing the ceiling of this test, we also added the 7800X3D, and again, note that it'd be higher with patches and needs retesting, but it serves its purpose. All CPUs below it are limiting the 4090 pairings. As a quick note too, we're not going to show a chart for 1080p low, but we did do some testing with it running around the city with the 8700G just ad hoc to see how it did in a holistic way, and for that we saw typically about 40 FPS average in the densest, most NPC heavy areas of the city, and it stretched up beyond that as you got out into the wilderness. Finally, for Baldur's Gate at 1440p medium, the heaviest GPU load of this game that we're testing right now, the R7-8700G memory scaling lessens. The 8700G with a 4090 versus the 8600G with a 4090 produces a 4.7% gap, whereas the 8700G with its IGP and DDR5-6400 memory versus the 8600G and the same is a 16% gap from 18 to 21 FPS. That shows us that although the CPU does contribute to limitations at the top end, the GPU, or the IGP, has a much bigger impact. Rainbow Six Siege is up now. The data here has changed and isn't comparable to our October dataset, so all of that's been removed. The 7600X and the 4090 set the ceiling at 640 FPS average. There'd be room with the 4090 to scale for, say, a 7800X3D, so we're still CPU bound in these entries. The The 8700G with a 4090 achieves 467 FPS average, illustrating the limits of the 8700G's CPU component. The core frequency ends up the limiting factor here. With DDR5-5600, there's an 18% gap between the 6400 results 82 FPS average and its 69 FPS average. Memory really matters for the IGP, and we're seeing that repeatedly here. Going to DDR5-6000 from DDR5-5600 is a 7% improvement, and from there to 6400, it's 10%. Like for like, the 8700G leads the 8600G by 16% when both use DDR5-6400 memory and IGPs. That's a 7% gap when both use RTX 4090s. As for the RX 6600, that leads the 8700G similar price part by 162%, with the 6500 XT and 1200F leading the 8600G by 86%. Imposing a heavier GPU constraint pushes the 8700G and 8600G entries with a 4090 closer together, so either would scale similarly if adding the same dGPU later for this game. The 5600 result sets the floor at 42 FPS average, giving way to the 6000 result at 7.4% uplift. Like for like, the 8700G leads the 8600G by 15%. The price equivalent option still leads significantly, but it may not be long before AMD gets to APU levels that equal parts like the 6500X. There's a T in there. And in either case, the APUs are actually in playable territory, especially at the lower 1080p or with the settings dropped to medium here. Starfield is up next, tested at 1080p low for this one. With these settings, the 8700G using DDR5-6400 memory landed at 30 FPS average, with the DDR5-6000 kit at 28.6. The DDR5-6400 result is about 6.3% higher than the 6000 result, and like for like against the 8600G, we're seeing a significant uplift moving to the 8700G. As for discrete solutions, the RX 6600 outperforms the APUs by about more than double once again. The 6500 XT has been removed from this data because it was functionally unplayable. We noticed during actual gameplay that as we played longer, the frame pacing became just completely untenable and the results were all over the place. F1 2023 is up now. This is another good testing title because it shows a type of game that's playable with relatively high graphics quality on the APUs. The 8700G overclock makes a return here at 57.4 FPS average with our PBO application, GPU-OC. That puts it ahead of the baseline 6400 result at 54 FPS by 6%. The baseline result leads the 6000 result by 5.5%, which itself leads the 5600 result by 7%. The 8600G is just below that entry, with the like-for-like comparison producing a 20% lead for the 8700G. The RX 6600 configuration has a significant advantage, largely attributable, as you'd expect, to the GPU. The 7600X isn't hitting a GPU limit yet either. We could go hundreds of FPS beyond this, and so that shows there's still scaling room in the test if the other parts keep up. The 8700G with a 4090 depicts the 7600X as able to unleash an additional 22% performance from better utilizing that GPU. F1 2023 at 1440p gives us a more GPU-intensive look at performance. Here, the 7600X is at about the same level as before, showing us that we're CPU-bound at the very top of the chart. The 8700G with an overclock led the baseline result by 4.7% at 37.7 to 36 FPS average. The baseline DDR5-6400 configuration outperformed the 6000 config by 5%, with the DDR5-6000 option outdoing the 5600 option by 7.2%. The 8600G lands below that at about 31 FPS average and giving the 8700G with DDR5-6400 a lead of 18% here. Two discrete parts still lead here at $330. But again, there are trade-offs that may not be compatible with a build of that style. There's also more of a CPU limit if upgrading the GPU with that i3 in the future. So something like a 5600 might start to make sense, but APUs potentially end up in form factors that wouldn't fit a GPU anyway, so it depends what you're doing. Final Fantasy is up next. This one validated at the same performance levels as when we tested it in October, so old data can be shown and is still intact. But, of course, everything for the APUs is brand new. For scaling, the 8700G ran at 45 FPS with the 6400 kit, or 41.6 with the 6000 kit. It's about a 9% gap. The 8600G is next in line at 41 FPS average, so there's a 10% swing between this and the 8700G in this particular test case, which is relatively low compared to some of the others. Likely, it's the memory binding us up. And to help further solidify that hypothesis, we can look at the two 4090 entries. This is why they're here. The 8600G and the 8700G are within error of each other when using 4090s. Both of them are at about 150 FPS average, which indeed confirms that we are more bound by a non-CPU component, and it's not the GPU. So the only component left really is the memory, because the 4090 is definitely not limiting us. The 7600X and the 78X3D help illustrate that. The 8700G at 5600 also further amplifies the memory limitation side of the story, producing a large 15% swing as compared to the 6400 8700G entry on this chart. The new APUs are at about 3700X levels for CPU performance. At 1440p, the 8700G baseline performance was 26.6 FPS average, yielding to the 6500 XT and the 6600 in a significant way. Again, as an APU though, compared to past launches, this is impressive to come from one chip. The memory scale, meanwhile, is 7.3% over the 6000 entry and 11% over the 5600 entry. At the top, again, we're limited on the APUs. The recently tested 7600X helps establish the performance of a possible desktop part instead. So this product is a weird one. It's always been the case with the APUs. It's been a similar conclusion for like a decade now, although there have been times where they've broken out, especially for the early HTPC days. But it just, first thing out of the way is that it will not make more sense than a cheap CPU and a cheap GPU, especially if you're willing to consider used, but we didn't even have to, and we still blew it out of the water with performance. If all you want is the cheapest possible gaming computer. If you're looking for basically the maximum amount of money that I have to spend on the CPU and the GPU together is under $400, you actually can put something together, and it's really not bad. At least not bad if you're willing to play mostly 1080p, maybe some 1440 in there, depending on the game and the load. Not really any RT to speak of. But you know, that is a massive gaming segment, what I just described, and you can do it for under $400. The 65XT really do not like that GPU, to just be super clear. But if you had to buy new, you're not willing to do used, and there's absolutely no room in the budget, then that plus the i3-12100F, just as an example, sometimes looking at like 2x the performance, or very nearly in most cases. Going up a step to the 6600, which is a much better video card, and lately has been around $200. That plus an i3-12100F is a phenomenal pairing. And actually, you could do even better still, and you could go get an R5-5600 and the 6600, you'd be at about $330. So it's the same price as the 8700G and really good performance. So if all you care about is gaming performance and nothing else is a consideration other than price, then that's the direction to go. That does not invalidate the product though. So another aspect that's worth considering is a build without any space for a video card at all. I think that's probably what a lot of the people who want to use this in the audience are thinking about, is one of those HTPC setups where it's a very powerful and capable single solution, and this is a competent performer, both of them, but the 87 in particular, but a capable solution that doesn't even have 2 slots or 1 slot for a GPU. It's just a small box of some kind. And for some reason, you don't want it to be a soldered solution from a provider that uses an existing BGA option or something instead. Maybe you want socketability for future upgrades, whatever the case may be. But for those who have a use case for it, like an extremely small system, again, it does well. The thermal and the power envelope are impressive here. AMD maintains basically among the best efficiency and outdoes Intel for efficiency still, and for considerations. Intel's IGP, we actually did test it, and we didn't bother putting it in any of the charts because it was so far down, and sometimes it was completely unplayable. It's irrelevant. So it is not really a direct comparison. Like the 14900K's UHD 770 or whatever it is, not a linear comparison to these. It is a significant underperformer. So you might as well compare the 7950X to the 14900K at that point with IGPs only. That makes more sense than this does. Different class. Memory scaling absolutely matters. If you are going to buy one of these APUs, and especially if you're going to be playing games with it, that's important. We would strongly recommend that you buy as close to or at 6400 as possible. 6000 was okay, but actually in some of the games, the gap between 6000 and 6400 with the 2 kits we have, remember timings matter too. I mean, we didn't really get into those today, but the gap between those sometimes was like 5-6%. So commonly 3%. But 5 or 6% is kind of a lot. And the gap from 5600 to 6400 was sometimes closer to like 19%. So you really want to assign some budget for the memory. We tried one 7400 kit, and the time we had, we couldn't get good performance out of it. It was actually worse than the 6400 kit, and that was because the timings were just so loose to hit that. And frankly speaking, I personally don't have a ton of memory tuning experience. We've done it, we've done some live streams with it, but not particularly skilled in heavily tuning memory. So that's my disclosure to you. If you're more into memory OC or something, go for it. You can get a ton out of these, and maybe we'll try that in the future. But just 6400, if you're trying to use something out of the box, it seems like a good baseline for these. So that's kind of it for the review. The short version of the conclusion is if you just want cheap gaming and you have absolutely no other considerations like form factor or whatever future upgradability options, then don't buy this. Go buy a cheap GPU and CPU, and actually you should really seriously look at eBay or something for a cheap GPU, because that would get you even better than what we were testing here today if you go used and you're okay with it. And then for those of you who know you want this, you have a build idea, you got a project, or you want something really small form factor, it seems fine. It's not offensive in any particular way. The thermal power envelope's good, so if you want to use it for your project, there aren't a ton of major considerations other than the memory. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. If you want to support our testing, as always, go to store.gamersaccess.net and please grab one of these shirts. These have the memory module exploded on the front, which is particularly suitable for the APUs, given the memory reliance. So go grab one on the store. It helps fund our testing efforts directly. And that's it for this one. We'll have another review here in a day or two, and we'll see you then.